When we produce our bacteria as a protein ingredient, because of anaerobic fermentation, it produces biochemicals. So we also produce butyric acid. And we can derivatize butyric acid to make like normal butanol. The point here being is as we run fermentation process, I'm getting a conversion of inputs to outputs that is extremely high. And I'm making a food ingredient that's very, very valuable. And then I'm making a biochemical that also goes into the chemical industry to immediately deliver value. It decarbonizes the chemical industry. It's a direct replacement for petroleum-based chemicals.
Welcome to this week's episode of Leaders on a Mission, where I'm joined by inspiring leaders driven by the impact of creating a healthy and sustainable world. Now, in today's episode, I'm joined by Bryan Tracy, CEO and founder of Superbrewed, a pioneering biotech company, really producing protein through bacterial fermentation. And Bryan is a passionate biotech entrepreneur who certainly knows his history. And I've got to know Bryan pretty well over the last kind of year at various kind of functions. In fact, we keep bumping into each other. And I've managed to convince him to come on the show and take some time out of his busy day. So Bryan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So maybe we'll start off, and I suppose as you sit here today in your lab, kind of, I suppose, reflecting on your career, right? What's helped kind of really shape you kind of professionally as you sit here now?
Again, thanks, Simon, for the chance to be on your show. And for those who don't know Simon, he's got excellent travel advice. So I encourage you to reach out to him. In terms of my professional career, I've been very fortunate. I've been in the fermentation space my entire professional career. While I was doing my undergraduate degree, I actually worked full-time for Novozymes, which, as folks may now know, since their acquisition of Chris Hansen, is now Novonesis, so the world's largest precision recombinant protein fermentation company, which was an excellent experience for me at that time to recognize I should probably go off and do a PhD to get to the next level of understanding technically in connection to business. So I did that, and I spent the next 5 years doing a PhD in chemical engineering. And this was the first heyday of really Silicon Valley putting a lot of money into industrial biotech back in the early mid-2000s. And they were making a lot of investments into cellulosic biofuels. So trying to take the spent component of corn harvesting and convert that into ethanol and other fuels. My thesis research was being licensed to a number of companies. So I decided, why not just try to create a company for myself? And so I launched a company directly in grad school back in 2009 and have been on this journey of selling companies and starting up new ones along the way, which has brought me now to Superbrewed Food, which I can be very honest is the one that I'm most passionate about because it will absolutely have the greatest impact on the environment and society in general.
Tell me, were you always an entrepreneur? Because you go and do your PhD in your thesis, right? So was there ever a thought around academia, or was it always going to be a kind of entrepreneurial kind of view?
Yeah. So I've never been an academic, so this is no criticism of academics. I apologize if it comes across that way. But academia, oftentimes I feel like you become super ingrained and super world expert on a small subject matter that really 12 people care about. Or you don't necessarily get to take your exceptional knowledge and then place that into society for useful, nearer term impact. It might take a much longer time and a lot of buy-in from a lot of other entities. So what really excited me was, as an entrepreneur, was to be able to have the ability to transfer that technical knowledge into a real world solution in a time frame that I could see it, right? And Simon, we've talked about this a bit, but to be honest with you, to extend to the history of the company, and for me on my professional journey, my first company was acquired by a gentleman named Sas Somak. And so my first company was a company called Elkerton. We designed microorganisms for a lot of the world's biggest chemical companies like Evonik and Lanxess and so on. And then I sold that company to a gentleman named Sas. Sas was one of 3 guys who built a company called Applied Materials. And for those who aren't aware, Applied Materials makes the equipment that prints semiconductor chips. So for me, it was incredibly inspirational to work with a gentleman who, in the span of like 25 years of his professional lifetime, changed the planet. Literally changed the planet to get to a point where nobody really had silicon chips to now, holy cow, how much has that been an issue, right? In supply chain to have enough semiconductor chips just to be able to produce cars. And Sash drove all the product line development. Actually, one of his pieces of equipment's in the National Smithsonian in the US. So on my entrepreneurial journey, it's been amazing to see or to have that inspiration of an individual who did exactly what drove me not to go into academics, which was, hey, let's go out commercially, try to bring ideas to fruition to benefit society. And maybe if you're lucky, it can transform the face of the planet, right? That's what we're hoping to do at Superbrewed, to be very honest with you.
This mission, which you've dedicated a fair amount of, certainly with Superbrewed, like 10 years or so, right? And before that, on your previous entrepreneurial journeys. But tell me about the resonating of this mission. Doing something better for the world, making the impact. Where did that really come to fruition, and how deep did it cut with you?
Yeah. So I've dedicated my life to it, right? So it's cut pretty deep. I guess really it happened about 10 years ago. And two things I learned through working with Novozymes and then interacting with the biofuels industry, doing all this fermentation concepts just in general, two things dawned on me. As we started looking at how does fermentation position itself to be truthfully competitive against the commodities of the world, because that's how it's really going to have its greatest impact. And at the end of the day, you needed to make money out of everything that fermentation produces. And oftentimes when people are thinking about fermentation, they're thinking about using fermentation to make an end product like an enzyme or a protein or a metabolite that might be ethanol to go as a fuel. Very oftentimes people lose sight of what made it, and it's a microorganism. A microorganism made it. Oftentimes it could be a yeast or an E. coli or a bacillus strain, something of this sort. And what I realized 10 years ago was, frankly, people were radically undervaluing that microorganism. And the best that people could do with that microorganism was maybe feed it to cattle as a very, very low value cattle feed. Maybe they could land apply it, or at the end of the day, they'd have to waste remediate it. And so for me, 10 years ago, the light came on and said, what if I can make that microorganism an extremely valuable product, the one that the market should value it at based upon its nutrition? And then couple that with the fact that we as humans, and I don't want to get too philosophical about this, but we as humans, we depend upon bacteria. We eat bacteria every single day to support our nutrition. Your gut microbiome, what lives inside of you today, plays a critical role in converting the food you eat into the nutrition that you absorb. And a large part of that nutrition you absorb is the microorganisms that live inside of you. But yet, believe it or not, no company, no entity has ever commercialized a bacteria food ingredient as a macro ingredient. It's never been done. We eat yeast all the time. Nutritional yeast, baker's yeast. We eat now fungus, not necessarily a yeast as you would think about, but another fungus in alternative meats. You've heard of companies like Meaty or what used to be Infinite Roots, right? And I think it's wonderful what those companies are doing. I think it's amazing. However, humans evolved. We evolved as humankind to eat bacteria. So the light came on saying, we need to make more money out of fermentation. And humans naturally eat bacteria. So we have become now the first ever commercially approved in major jurisdictions, the US and soon to be Europe, the ability to sell bacteria biomass as a nutritional food ingredient.
Why hasn't bacteria been commercial? Well, why is this the first time? And for instance, yeast and other microorganisms you've mentioned have been?
Yeah, it's a great question. The realistic part of it, in terms of the science-y kind of justifiable basis from a tech perspective, is bacteria grow incredibly fast, really, really quickly. And one of the things that they need to do as they grow quickly is they need to make mRNA. They need to make DNA, one of the bases for making proteins and so forth. Because they grow so fast, they also make lots of that. Well, there's an issue. You can't eat too much nucleic acid, mRNA and DNA. So in order for our ingredient to be edible, You have to reduce that nucleic acid content. Now, that's very challenging for some bacteria. Some bacteria, like the one we use, it's actually not difficult. But we were able to solve that issue. So it could be edible at very, very high levels. Like we have approval in the US for you, Simon, or me, Bryan, to consume our food ingredient at like 120 grams a day. So we solved that issue. The other component of it is, to be honest with you, big companies and commercial entities are a little bit, in my opinion, way too risk adverse. You'd have to get full regulatory approval through a very rigorous process. Eat these microorganisms. The vast majority of other microorganisms, yeast and fungus, or like probiotic strains, they've gotten into our food system historically through like dairy cultures or through some other pathway over the past 100 years. And so they've been grandfathered in. Very few new microorganisms have actually gone through the regulatory process to be market approved. So we decided it was worth the effort. It's taken 4 years, but it's worth the effort.
Congratulations with that. I
Thank
know
you.
it's it's a significant achievement. So tell me about the company then, Superbrewed Food. Just talk a little bit about, I suppose, the problems that you're solving here and what the real vision for the company is.
Yep. So Superbrewed, as I mentioned about 10 years ago, dawned on me we needed to make more money out of fermentation. And that meant we need to make as much money out of the microorganism as we possibly could. So at that point in time, we put a pause on doing genetic modifications. And we said, we're no longer going to genetically modify microorganisms. We're going to go out into nature and harvest nature for the amazing breadth of microorganisms it already has to offer. So we went out and we discovered the highest protein content microorganism that we've ever seen in the literature or the IP landscape. It's 85% digestible protein, this microorganism as it grows, right? And then at the same time, as we make the organism, we said to ourselves, the other big challenge fermentation faces, which has become very apparent in the past 3 years, but frankly, this was happening decades ago, was fermentation facilities are expensive. They're really expensive to build. And so then from our perspective, it had two components to it. Let's make our processing technology as lowest risk as possible. Because if you want to build something, if you're doing a product, a new technology, a new process, like miracle number one, staple to miracle number two, staple to miracle number three, which financial investors say it's one level of risk, risen to the power of that level of risk, risen to the power of that level of risk. It's just too much for somebody to invest $100 million into building a facility. So we wanted to do something that was standard, simple processing technology. It directed us towards anaerobic fermentation. Anaerobic fermentation is how every single Heineken beer is produced today. Every Budweiser beer is produced today. It's actually how about 40 billion gallons or 100 billion liters of ethanol to blend with gasoline is produced today across the world. It's massive, massive scale, right? The other component is when we produce our bacteria as a protein ingredient, because of anaerobic fermentation, it produces biochemicals. So we also produce butyric acid. And we can derivatize butyric acid to make like normal butanol. So the point here being is, as we run fermentation process, I'm getting a conversion of inputs to outputs that is extremely high. And I'm making a food ingredient that's very, very valuable. And then I'm making a biochemical that also goes into the chemical industry to immediately deliver value. It decarbonizes the chemical industry. It's a direct replacement for petroleum-based chemicals. So I get really high outputs from the inputs. I get a tremendous amount of additional revenue, about 80 times more than you could in the past off the microorganisms when people genetically modified them. And I'm decarbonizing multiple of the world's biggest bad actors in terms of CO2 contributions to the environment. So I'm leveraging multiple industries to care. I'm leveraging already a hugely built out industry, anaerobic fermentation industry. It's operational excellence in order to be able to revamp it, give it a facelift. So instead of making low value commodity fuel outputs, it can now make high value food ingredients and biochemicals at the same time.
Great. What was the real kind of journey and the main challenges in creating the process so it could use anaerobic fermentation, and then it would then produce these side streams as well, which is giving you a lot more kind of value.
To be honest with you, that's not been the challenge. That was the years of just understanding the industry and being in the space for a very long time from a technical perspective. That's been the simplest.
Okay.
The process, the organism growing, we have an organism that grows, like our fermentation times for the tech folks listening to this call are 20 hours. I mean, they're lightning quick. And again, we're making simple things that can be separated from a downstream separations perspective. They're very low cost operations. They're very robust, like tolerant to different pHs and temperatures and so forth. That hasn't been our issue. What's really been our issue is, working in the fundraising capital environment where we're not necessarily, we're bucking the trend. There's a lot of motivation and interest in precision fermentation. I'm a big believer in fermentation, don't get me wrong. But there's been many investments over the past 5 years that I think are just misinformed in terms of are they going to be consistent with the timelines of venture funds? And are they going to be able to leverage the right partnerships and capital resources down the road to be at scale in timelines that these funds need to exit? And to be very sincere with you, we experienced this 20 years ago in the cellulosic biofuel days. We learned this, but history is too short-lived. So we've kind of duplicated those same mistakes. What that created for us is we've had a very different approach than what a lot of the investor community, how they've been looking at this over the past 5 years. And it's challenging to be different. It's easier to be the same. And it's also telling a story of how I have a disruptive product, an amazing new product that humans evolved to consume. And that's going to change the way we consume in the future. That's, you would typically think, compelling, but a lot of investors saw it as market risk, right? Oh, the product's never been in the market today. Correct. So that's where our challenge has been. We need to develop the market for it. We didn't need to do the technology, whereas investors were still saying instead, we'd rather take a technology, right? I don't want market risk. I want technology risk. And we said, I'm willing to deal with market risk. I don't want the technology risk, because our history would say, you're not in a position to put $300 million into your fermentation company over the next 4 years to build a plant. And truth be told, fast forward, we're right. They're not. And actually, it's still to be determined if consumers know what, non-animal animal proteins are. There's still a lot of uncertainty in the market side of those products, whereas we brought forward to consumers a product that we label in a way that's familiar to them. So we've not observed too much market risk.
So we're talking here about non-animal animal proteins.
Yep.
Okay, so it's identical to an animal protein.
So that's the precision world, right? And as I've mentioned, again, I'm a huge fan of fermentation. Huge fan. And I think it's exciting to try to contemplate using fermentation to make identical, the exact same animal output, but in a different genetically engineered sort of yeast system. That's interesting. Don't get me wrong. Our protein is not that. Our protein is a first of kind, totally new protein. It's a microorganism. So it's the same type of concept as, like I mentioned previously, companies like Meaty or Infinite Roots or Mycotechnologies, who are making fungal or shiitake type of biomass.
Yeah.
It's also almost identical to nutritional yeasts, right? Coming out of the brewing industry. We are the whole entire microorganism. And as interesting as this, I hope people find it interesting, our microorganism lives inside of you right now. It is actually native to the human digestive system. It plays a role inside of you right now to help convert the food that you're eating into the nutrition that you're absorbing. And you are actually consuming our microorganism naturally inside of you.
Yeah. What's it called?
So the product is called Postbiotic Cultured Protein.
Okay.
And this is a new era that's happening. Many consumers have heard of probiotics. And that's a microorganism that you might eat as a supplement or eat in a yogurt culture that you want to live inside of you. And then more consumers are starting to understand what's called a prebiotic, like a fiber, like inulin or chicory roots and so forth. These are components that would feed microorganisms you want to live inside of you. Well, you should ask yourself the question, why do I want a microorganism to live inside of me? And the reality is they make postbiotics. Cargill would state it, and I love the way Cargill states this. Prebiotics are the fuel to feed your gut microorganisms. Probiotics are the factories to supplement your existing microorganisms. Postbiotics are the goods. They are actually what you're absorbing. So we're the first entity ever to make a bacteria biomass postbiotic that's a macronutrient ingredient. And this is the next wave of biotics. It's feeding yourself the goods as opposed to hoping that the goods get produced.
Mm.
And then the cultured part of it, we have to label it such a way that it's sufficiently descriptive. And we produce it through fermentation. Another way of talking about fermentation is culturing. So we label it as cultured because it describes to the consumer how it was produced. And it's 85, 87%, somewhere in that range, protein. And it's a bunch of, the rest of it's B vitamins and healthy minerals, but it's made protein.
How would I consume it? Is it through beverage? Is it through a cookie? Where's, how am I going to eat this?
Yeah. We've yet to find a way that you can't eat it. It's been amazing. This is one of the journey components of my entrepreneurial journey that in the food space has been phenomenal. Because the food market's so competitive, when you bring forth a new ingredient that has new marketing claims around it, it has new nutritional paradigms, it has new functionalities. I've been amazed by how many of these major CPG companies are saying, awesome, I'm going to try it. I'm going to tell you how I can use it. So we put it into milks, like alternatives to milk. We put it into nutritional beverages, like a protein shake you might have in between lunch and dinner to hold you over, or performance beverages like a sports workout beverage or after beverage, even medicated beverages for tube-fed feeding or aging nutrition. We also put it into alternatives to cheese or hybrids with real dairy cheese, baked goods, making protein-fortified breads, or cookies, like snacking cookies that have less fat, more protein, more B vitamins. We put it into alternative meats. We make high moisture meat analogs. To be honest with you, we are working with CPG companies that put it into every kind of section of the grocery store today, as opposed to certainly fresh produce injected into a tomato, but we're going into nearly all components of the grocery store today off of the creativity of the CPGs.
No, it sounds like it's got a lot of potential. And I noted, like a few weeks ago, I saw the press news. I think it was with your partnership with Dola.
Yep.
No, I'm curious. I suppose now the involvement of the industry and where you get to is how you bring this to market. Right. This is obviously the big question.
Yep.
Have you had to evolve that thinking quite a lot over the last few years?
Oh, absolutely, a bunch. So first, you hit the nail on the head. Dola is an exceptional partnership. Partnerships are key because the ecosystem, to get an end product to you in the center of your plate that you cook, or to get it into your snack that goes into your bag as you head off to work, there are so many players along that value chain. We made a critical decision 3 years ago that we had no ability really, and it was too risky to contemplate being a branded CPG company ourselves. So we decided we were going to stay the course. We're going to deliver an exceptional quality, exceptional functionality, exceptional marketing claims around an ingredient. And we're a B2B ingredient player. With that in mind, then, we need to have partners along the spectrum of the supply chain. We need partners upstream, and not all of these are publicly announced, but I can tell you that we have amazing partnerships of entities that source to us the inputs for our production process. We have amazing partners to do the production. Dola, as you are well aware of now, they've been phenomenal in order to be able to get into a facility to produce at commercial scale, to start putting this into the market as we find our pathway to build our own facility, which we will do in the next 3 to 4 years. And then we have partnerships, obviously, at the end point, the CPG companies. It's public information too. Bell, Group Bell, the Laughing Cow cheese, Baby Bell cheese, Boursin cheese, Fury cheese. They've been phenomenal in order to take a new ingredient and find so many different places to put it into their product portfolio. And we leverage that same sort of relationship with other CPGs, not publicly announced. I can tell you we work with about 29 different CPGs I'm partnering with them to find how our ingredient can deliver value to their ESG goals, their corporate sustainability goals, to their customer segments where they know how to market to their customer. I can't come up with a catchy phrase, one catchy phrase for our ingredient that's going to be attractive to Simon, to Bryan, to populations all throughout Europe, all throughout the US, Canada, Australia, you name it. Like, that's their job. So we created a Swiss Army knife and we allow them to drive that messaging. That's been the key to this: partnerships, partnerships, and partnerships. And there's definitely going to be more that will be announced in the next 3 months.
Yeah, and how long have they taken to evolve to the point of, what are the key steps with something along those lines? If you take the Dola partnership, as it were.
Yeah, depends. Partner to partner. But on the Doler side, we've been working with Doler for almost 3 years. So it was a long work in the progress. Like, it took quite a bit of time to get to a place, which I think most of these multinational large companies are going to do the exact same. They're not just going to say, hey, I really like Bryan, or I really like this food ingredient, and I'm going to next week make a public announcement on this. Heck no. They do a lot of diligence on how realistic this is, how viable it is to their customers that they're aware of, and so forth. So it took like 3 years in order to get to a position where we had a much better line of sight as to what's the value proposition for the two of us, right? And what's the right fit of that relationship. In general, I would, for other entrepreneurs, anticipate year-plus timelines to forge these types of partnerships, and longer if you anticipate forging a much more substantial partnership.
Yeah, that's quite extensive, isn't it? As it were.
Yeah.
What are the steps to that, if you don't mind just going into it, just at a high level? Like, what are the key milestones that you need to get to in order to be having the press announcement, as it were?
Yeah, for sure. I met my Match.com. It's quick to meet somebody, but it took us 3 years to get married. And most of the time, I think that's how these partnerships are as well. You're speed dating all the time at these conferences, future food tech, like we saw each other not too long ago, Simon. But you're going to build a core relationship with them. So the steps of that, I think in general, are several, but creating credibility with them is, I think, the big thing that you need to do early on. You're talking about, here's something that I have to offer. They're stating to you, here's something that to offer. So establishing credibility between the two parties that legitimately there's a possibility off of what resources each have to bring to bear. And then there's a lot of conversation, discussion, and interaction in terms of fleshing out what is that relationship. I mean, there's not a one size fits all, and it takes a long time to go through all the checks and so forth and all the conversations to see what are the right engagements for these two entities to have. And as a startup company, we're often extremely protective of how much ground we give up, so to speak, to a big corporate CPG. And I'll be the first to tell you, I think oftentimes startups can be naive for sure, but I think actually in recent history, we think too highly of ourselves, startups. And we should oftentimes recognize that these big CPGs have a lot to offer us. And so we should be very willing to have more in-depth conversations on giving them market advantages, maybe some small segment of exclusivity or something of this sort. And let's be less risk averse to that as entrepreneurs up front in order to explore what those relationships can look like. Otherwise, you might find yourself in a challenging position a year later where you were unwilling to concede any space. And now you're left with and you need to raise another $10 million in order to build that infrastructure that you could have instead have done with a couple of partners. I think that's something that we've learned over the past couple of years. Being stingy and thinking too highly of ourselves is an issue. But credibility, understanding what's the right type of engagement between the two parties, and then you have to jump in technically quickly to validate that there's an opportunity space for two parties, and then it kind of morphs from there. Hopefully you have a long-term relationship marriage with each other afterwards.
Have you generally found the people in those organizations have remained the same, or have you had to navigate through those things changing?
Yeah, that's really tough, right? I mean, I think there's two big issues. You're like marrying 10 people as opposed to one person in these organizations, and it only takes one person to say no in order for it not to go forward. And then you're also racing against the clock because you have the 10 decision makers or whatever it happens to be. And if you look at the lifespans of some of these people inside of their roles within these companies, they transition every couple of years or they jettison, they go out somewhere else. Yeah, that's a big issue. So you got to go quickly in order to build that relationship. And I would also suggest to entrepreneurs relation on just one person in these organizations. Because unfortunately, if your champion leaves, if they get promoted into another position, typically that's not an issue. If they get promoted, that might be to your benefit. But if they get moved to a different business or if they decide they've had enough and they head out, oh my goodness, you might be at square one, reestablishing a new relationship. So yeah, I think that's a really big challenge, as you mentioned. Their longevity in their positions to get it all the way through to the end point. And then the other component is you oftentimes need to get, 5, 6, 10 checkoffs. And if one says no, well, oh well.
Absolutely. I'm thinking about, Bryan, I've done lots of hiring for companies on the BD side that are looking to bring in talent to go out to the food industry and build these relationships with. And my general sense is that investors and executives almost expect quicker turnaround around these deals than is possibly feasible out there. And I think in my experience, it's maybe a lack of understanding of the food industry and how it works.
Yep.
Because it is a very conservative industry, right? So
Yep.
how have you found adapting to that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I don't think you solve the issue for the big companies. Bell Group, who we work with, has been phenomenal, but they've had internally this big innovation push in order to develop that. Bryan Tracy, I could never have come into Group Bell and say, hey, you guys need to get your act together and be more efficient doing this. That never would have worked. First, find the right ones to work with, right? And on the investor side, the exact same situation. Find the right investors who have the timeline in their mind, the evergreen type of nature, perhaps, or the bandwidth in order to do this, as opposed to a very formulaic 5 years or bust type of perspective. And on all that note, we've been family office supported. Our new investors that will be announced in the coming months, they're not a family office, they're a financial investment fund, but they as well, we did a lot of vetting and vice versa. They're the type of entity who understand the timelines associated with it. So yeah, it's a great point. You don't fix that issue with organizations and funds that don't know it. You need to go explore with other entities who get it.
Tell me, there's lots to do in the role of a CEO founder. You speak about all the relationships and the technical, and we covered a lot of functional aspects during this kind of conversation. What aspects do you enjoy the most?
Oh wow,
and the least in your role as a CEO?
Yeah, the one I enjoy the least is fundraising, although that's the most important. One of the main reasons being because, as I alluded to, it's not so much in your control. Like you got to respond to the current environment, to the milieu of what's taking place, fit yourself into their mindset necessarily, as opposed to 100% driving your proposition. That's my least favorite, I guess. But all the other ones, I enjoy so much of the rest of it. Developing people is one of the things that I really, really enjoy the most. Like trying to bring in an individual who you enable them, right? As opposed to micromanage them and allow them to explore. And so, for example, our head of commercial development, Julie Post-Smith, she has a lengthy history in the protein space, but bringing her in, getting her up to speed on what it is, what we have, and she being able to put her fingerprint on how we approach this and so forth has been great. And she's gone out and done a great job of planting seeds and positioning us in engaging relationships with CPGs that has driven quite a bit of success to the point where we're effectively sold out on our protein for the next couple of years, which is kind of unusual to hear in this space. Enabling people to develop themselves, being supportive to allow them to develop themselves, I think is one of the things I really, really enjoy. And mentoring others, right, is hoping that, like I said, I'm not down on fermentation. I'm obviously believe in fermentation. A lot of the stuff that's taken place in this investment space in the past 3 years was just misconceived, misguided in terms of what's the timelines that's going to take. They're still going to deliver value. But guiding other entrepreneurs and mentoring them to think maybe differently based upon the 15 years of burn marks that I've dealt with I live under the shadow of DuPont. The DuPont has done, over the past 50 years, the vast majority of what everybody's researching these days. We just don't know about it because they don't publish their negative results or their lack of business success. And jumping in, as you've heard from me, Simon, going and taking time to get your own mentors who, from the technical, commercial, business, history sort of side of these industries, go listen to them, learn from them, use their information to understand why didn't it work and solve that issue. Then bringing that to others. That's my goal. Right.
So tell me about your hopes and dreams now. It sounds like you've really hit some incredible milestones. You're in a fantastic position. What does success look like for you in the next 10 years?
Sure. Pretty easy. So the next 2 years is to be robustly in market with this ingredient in the US. We're soon to get market approval in Europe as well. So be rolling into Europe to do two things: to have consumers delivers, and then after those 2 years to transition to make the consumers aware of what it is delivering the benefit. Consumers buy on benefits. They don't necessarily buy on unknown things, unbranded, unknown, unfamiliar components. In fact, they won't buy you if you're unfamiliar. So it is commercially get the ingredients, benefits, and a robust set of products to the consumer and having them realize, oh my goodness, I'm getting these benefits in my life, and then transition to making them aware as to what it is. That enables us then over the next 4 years to build a global scale facility. That is my personal mission. A lot of things that people have been talking about and attempting and so forth, a lot of buzz about its potential to society and the world. It's true, it has this potential, but nobody still is at such phenomenal scale that it's having impact. You need to be big. You need to be delivering at global scale. We are on this precipice where in 4 years, I intend to be standing inside of our global scale production facility in the US. And then from there, we've taken an approach where it's copy paste to do a second, third, fourth, fifth facility. So in 10 years, Simon, mark my word, I'd love to come back on your show and you can hold me to this at every conference we see each other. We'll check in. In 10 years, I would like to see us producing on at least 3 continents these ingredients.
Well, you're going to be very busy, Bryan. I better let you get back.
Yeah, for sure.
Really appreciate you coming on and sharing your journey and the journey of a really exciting company, and wish you all the very best.
I appreciate it. And I hope to see you again on the conference trail, or maybe in Rome or somewhere else like that too in the future.
Absolutely.